Available everywhere podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys are enjoying the show thus far. We are going to take a little bit of a break from our deep dives into NFL skill position groups that I think have fantastically fascinating fantasy implications. And we are going to deep dive into college football. Week 1 of the college football season was underway last Saturday. And a lot of interesting storylines, a lot of interesting performances around the college football landscape, a lot of new guys, a lot of intrigue surrounding young freshmen, a lot of intrigue surrounding established veterans as well. So I think that the guys have chosen may lead to some tension and skepticism in the comments. Let me know what you think as we go along this list, position by position, of some guys that I really liked. But ultimately, these are the guys who I would want on my fantasy college football team. Not necessarily quote-unquote stars who stat padded or whatever throughout the week. There are some, though. I just think these are guys who, if you do play fantasy college football, you might not want to overlook in terms of their abilities to get the job done, is what I'm trying to say. So without further ado, let's jump right into this kind of college football Week 1 fantasy recap. Let's start off at the QB position. I have two guys here that really stood out to me, maybe not just because of their stats and production, because of what they did with their offenses. And two offenses that really will profile as two of the more intriguing ones in the SEC. And let's start off with the younger of the two guys. How about Nico Iamaleava, the redshirt freshman at Tennessee, and the keys to the car for the Tennessee offense. And he, albeit against Chattanooga, lit up. He had 28.2 FanDuel's fantasy points, 22 of 28 passing, 314 yards, 3 TDs, looked very comfortable distributing the ball, 11.2 yards per attempt. Now, like I said, it was against Chattanooga. Tennessee will have a lot more tests, including in Week 2, where we will talk about this later in the week as they take on NC State, a top 25 opponent. But Nico Iamaleava gained confidence from this game. It's not going to be important. It's not going to be a game on his resume that NFL scouts will be pointing to in 3 or 4 years' time. But it proves that you can't overlook guys who have promise, even though they may have a tough go of it. And Nico Iamaleava will have a tough go of it. As Tap to Learn said, Ashton Jeanty blew doors off for Boise State. Wish I had him. We'll get to him later because he is someone who I really like, especially in that group of 5 conversation. But back to Nico for the time being. I think this kid has a lot of upside. There's a lot of potential. And this Tennessee offense might go a little bit underrated. They have veterans in Squirrel White and Brew McCoy at the wide receiver position. So if Nico Iamaleava shows the composure and the poise and he showed against an FCS opponent and translates it to the SEC, he will be as good as gold. But the next QB, you might be very mad at me for including him. And I promise this isn't Texas bias. This is just based off what I see and how he operated the system this week against Colorado State and how I think he will translate throughout the season. It is Quinn Ewers. Only had 20.8 fantasy points, 20 of 27, 260 yards, 3 TDs, 9.6 yards per attempt. And I know what you're thinking. Don't let bias get to your head. But this bias aside, I think that this performance when Quinn Ewers was important not just in the fantasy realm and what he's going to look like as a fantasy QB in his final year at Texas, but it just shows how in that Texas offense, all he needed to do was kind of relax. And I think that even though they're adding so many transfer pieces after they lost so much production in last year's draft, the thing about Quinn Ewers is that he's just a steady hand who now understands Sark's setup enough that he can keep his composure and poise and have it translate to effective stats. And it may not be the prettiest stats at the end of the day. It may not be the yardage production of some of the guys this week. But it's important to understand the nuances of the QB position in fantasy college football and fantasy football as a whole. You're not necessarily looking for guys that put up 30 points or stat pad. I want a guy with balance, and Quinn Ewers showed that balance this week. So those are my two guys that really impressed me in terms of the quarterback position. Let's go back to Tap to Learn's comment, because Ashton Jeanty was absolutely ridiculous. And the reason I included him is A, because he was absolutely ridiculous, and B, he may be a guy that a lot of people might not have had on their radar for fantasy college football because of the fact he plays for Boise State. And even though they're one of the higher profile Group of 5 teams, they really had a lot of storylines this offseason, like the acquisition of Malachi Nelson. So I really think that Ashton Jeanty was able to go on the radar, but this weekend he really proved himself as one of the best running backs, all-purpose, what-have-you players in college football. On 20 carries, 267 yards for 6 TDs, 13.7 yard average on his carries. And I know what you're thinking. Chris, why are we talking about a Boise State running back if you know there are other running backs like Ollie Gordon, perhaps, who are getting talked about more and more people know about? Well, I want to introduce you to Ashton Jeanty. That's the point of this. This is a guy who I felt like coming into the season was not getting the respect he deserved. And this Boise State system, and all the rumblings in the offseason, Malachi Nelson is going to transfer this program at quarterback and stuff like that. A lot of people may have forgotten that Ashton Jeanty, at the end of the day, is one of, if not the best all-purpose player in college football. I said it. I said it about a Group of 5 guy. And if Boise State want to compete for a 12-team playoff spot and an at-large bid as one of the 6 conference champions, they're going to need to rely on Ashton Jeanty to expect a lot more of these stat lines out of him. And in fact, they needed every yard from him as well. It was a close game against Georgia Southern, actually. So they did need every yard for him, so look for him to get a lot of yardage production. But I think that at the running back position, as far as I'm concerned, no one comes close to touching him. He is, in fact, the only running back who I'm going to say merits mentioning in that system. But let's go to the excitement of the wide receivers. And this is a guy who everyone knows I love on this show. If you've been watching the past couple of episodes, or even way back to when I started this show, when we talk about fantasy college football, this was a wide receiver who I really liked. There's no really special attribute about this guy. He's not necessarily that speedy. He's not necessarily one of the best route runners. He's just a boundary receiver who has a high IQ. He's worked with his QB since middle school, actually. And that rapport really has carried them far throughout their careers. And that is Tetairoa McMillan of Arizona. And I looked at his performance. It was not the prettiest, but the reason why I feel like not only is he the best wide receiver in college football, but potentially the wide receiver 1 in the 25 NFL draft, is because of his ability to understand players by understanding his experiences with them. And I know that he won't have Noah Fafita in the NFL, but the reason why Tetairoa McMillan will succeed at the NFL level is because of his intelligence. That's what separates him from some wide receivers outside of Arizona and outside of the national profile. 10 receptions in their game, 304 yards, 4 touchdowns, 30.4 yard average on his catches. That is ridiculous. And so, Tet McMillan, you may have known about him in fantasy implications for fantasy college football because of the way I talk about him so highly, but he's a guy who, in the long run, in the NFL next year, could be a sneaky mid-round pick or a flyer off your bench as a waiver wire option, because I think that Tet McMillan will translate very well to the NFL. So he's a guy. But let's talk about someone from this freshman wide receiver class. A lot of hype surrounding them. A lot of freshmen making their college football debut this weekend. We talk about Jeremiah Smith and the excitement he brings to Ohio State. We talk about Ryan Wingo actually leading Texas in receiving yards. But the guy who won the day for me was Ryan Williams out of Alabama, because he only had 2 catches. And his 2 catches were 84-yard and 55-yard touchdowns for 139 yards and 2 TDs. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Alabama offense, it's always going to be good, so the targets will get distributed. I know that Kendrick Law and Kobe Prentice have been there for a while, but it does kind of give you hope and optimism that an Alabama receiver might be a true wide receiver 1 for you, because I think about them now as one of those teams that will rely on distributing the wealth, because Jalen Milroe can be very good in that regard for them. But having a guy like Ryan Williams who can just, on a dime, get 2 catches, 2 touchdowns, and long ones at that, really speaks to the abilities that Kalen DeBoer is trying to get out of these wide receivers and have them translate to their play on the field. So I was really excited about that. But overall, the college football landscape, man, very exciting. And now that this is a 12-team playoff, this could be one of the wackiest seasons. A lot of big stat lines could happen, continue to happen. Because not just these guys that I mentioned. There were guys that I could have mentioned as well. As Splash Bro says, it's the first ever college football trade, a fantasy college football trade. Ooh, I love this. I got an offer of a Buka for a Strepa. I love this trade offer. Because here's why. Emeka Buka is seen as one of, if not the best wide receiver right now in college football. There's a lot of hype around him. Coming back, not having Marvin Harrison look over his shoulder anymore. So, a lot of hype was surrounding him. But the question was, will Will Howard be able to get him the football? And from what we saw in that game against Akron, while it definitely looked like their second half was indicative of what their season could be like as this offense gets more fluidity, Will Howard, I don't necessarily trust as much as what I saw out of Cam Ward, who looked really fantastic in that game against Florida. And Xavier Strepo, let's not forget about him. He's also a high-end wide receiver. Been around the block a lot. Been in Miami for so long. Waited for a quarterback. Much like, say, comparison to Drake London in the NFL. Just waiting for that consistent QB play to come. So I really like this. If I'm you, I'm immediately scooping up Restrepo. I love him. I love Miami. They're now the cream of the crop in the ACC at this current moment. Their best hope for the playoff, I believe. So Xavier Restrepo for Emeka Buka. I really like that. That's a steal. And I think that you will get and be very glad to get a guy like Xavier Restrepo on your fantasy team. So that's a fantastic trade. The first college football trade. Thank you, Splash Bro, for that comment. But overall, college football is going to be very exciting. If you do get the opportunity to play fantasy college football, please do keep commenting, much like Splash Bro just did, about any offers you receive, because even though it's not as popular as fantasy football, and when we're getting into the fantasy football season, I really want to talk about it as much as possible, because this is going to be a very excitable fantasy college football year. But that's just about do it for this segment. Coming up for our last segment of today's show, we actually look at our first ever wide receiver room in terms of these deep dives. It is a 3-headed monster that's going to be the talk of the league. We'll be right back after the break to talk about that to close out today's show.